I still can't shake the feeling. It wasn't anything dramatic or in your face. No big reveal or public scandal. Just this creeping, nagging sense that something wasn't quite right. Sophie and I had been in the trenches together for years, building the business from the ground up. Late nights, endless brainstorming, all of it. She'd been my partner in every sense, and I thought we were in sync. But lately, it was like she was speaking a different language. Sure, she still showed up to meetings, still had that same fire when talking numbers, but her eyes, her focus, it was clear her mind had drifted elsewhere. When we landed that massive contract, the one we'd been after for months, I thought it would feel like the culmination of everything we'd worked for. I envisioned us celebrating our big win together. But when we went out to celebrate, I noticed a shift in Sophie's energy. She wasn't really excited about the accomplishment itself. No, she was already talking about the next step, the bigger picture, how we could go global, how this deal would open doors to new clients, new opportunities. She kept saying things like, "We're almost there, Tyler. Just think, soon we'll be at the top where the real players are." Something about the way she said it sounded off. That's when we met Maxwell Reed. The guy was like a walking cliché, a self-made millionaire with that smug, "I've seen it all" grin. He wore his wealth like a cologne, always hovering a little too close. At first, I thought he was just another investor, someone who could help fund our next move. But from the second Sophie shook his hand, I could tell she was seeing him in a completely different light. He wasn't just a potential benefactor, he was a lifestyle to her. And hell, she seemed instantly captivated by him. Maxwell rambled on about his trips, the places he'd been, and the exclusive circles he ran in. I chalked it up to typical rich guy showboating, but Sophie ate it up. I caught her laughing at his stories, her eyes practically glued to him, her smile hanging on longer than I'd seen in months. She had this little habit, flipping her hair when she was really interested. She used to do it when we first started dating. It was a small gesture, but there it was, plain as day, for Maxwell. I tried to convince myself it was just professional admiration. After all, we were trying to expand, right? But as the days passed, it wasn't just Maxwell. Sophie started pulling away from me in ways that felt almost surgical, little cuts, subtle but painful. She'd stay out late, saying she was meeting with potential investors or working on strategies. I tried to ask her about it, just to get a sense of where we stood, but every time I brought up Maxwell, she'd shut me down, telling me it was purely professional, and maybe it was, but there was something in her eyes when she said it, something defensive, like she was trying to protect herself from an accusation I hadn't even made. I noticed the shift at the office, too. Maya, my assistant, who'd been with us from the very beginning, started noticing the private meetings Sophie was scheduling, the ones that weren't on the calendar. Maya's sharp. She has this way of picking up on things without saying a word. One day, she casually asked me if I knew why Sophie was setting up all these off-the-record meetings. She wasn't prying, but I knew exactly what she meant. I just didn't want to go there. Not yet. Then came the distance at home. Sophie started coming back late, and sometimes she'd smell like a new perfume, something I'd never smelled on her before. Expensive stuff, too, not the usual brands. She'd mumble something about high-profile clients, about needing to look the part. But I started getting the feeling she wasn't just dressing up for business. It was for someone or something else. Our conversations got shorter, colder. She'd rush past me, always too busy, always having an excuse for why she couldn't stay or talk. When I'd ask what was going on, she'd respond with, "You know, this business doesn't run on autopilot, Tyler." I almost felt guilty for asking, like I was the one being unreasonable. I finally talked to Caleb about it. He'd been my friend for years, even before Sophie came into the picture. He listened patiently, like he always does, as I vented. Then, after I finished, he gave me that serious look, the one I'll never forget. "Look, Tyler," he said, "I'm not saying she's doing anything wrong, but just keep an eye on her. People can get carried away with success. Just don't let your guard down." He didn't have to say more. We both knew exactly what he meant. Still, I tried to convince myself that Sophie was just getting caught up in the excitement of it all, that she wasn't up to anything shady. But even after that talk, that nagging feeling wouldn't go away. It was like an itch I couldn't scratch. Every time she left the house, every time she had another meeting. It was like that feeling grew stronger. I started noticing the small changes, how she'd glance at her phone too often, or linger on certain names in conversation. Maxwell's name, especially. She wasn't the Sophie I knew anymore. She was starting to feel like a stranger, and I couldn't tell if it was just in my head or if something really had changed. There I was, stuck in limbo. Part of me wanted to confront her, grab her phone, go through her messages and get some damn answers. But another part, the part that had built this life with her, that had invested so much, kept telling me to wait, to watch, to play it smart. I wasn't ready to take action, not yet. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. And once that suspicion creeps in, it's impossible to shake. It was like someone had cranked up the volume on everything Sophie did that felt wrong. She started dressing up more, way more. Sophie was always beautiful, and I appreciated that she took care of herself. But suddenly, she was buying all these expensive clothes and new perfumes. Things I'd never seen her wear. When I asked her about it, she'd brush me off, saying, "High-profile clients expect a certain look, Tyler." She said it with this tone, like I should have known better, like I was the one who didn't understand. She started staying later at the office, too. Said she was swamped with evening meetings, buried under reports and client presentations. But it wasn't just occasionally, it was every night now, and the excuses started wearing thin. Sometimes she'd be home by 10, other times it'd be after midnight. I wanted to believe her. I really did. But there was this constant nagging feeling I couldn't shake. Part of me hated that I was even entertaining these thoughts about her, but I couldn't ignore it. Especially when I saw how fast her wardrobe was changing, and how often she left the house with that new perfume hanging in the air. Then came the day Maya, my assistant, casually mentioned that Sophie had left her work laptop open. She didn't push me. She just let the remark slip, like it was nothing. I stood there, debating whether or not I should check it. I could feel myself overthinking, wondering if I was crossing a line. But in the end, my curiosity got the best of me. When I opened the laptop, I found emails between Sophie and Maxwell. They weren't overtly scandalous, not at first glance. But there were these little red flags, subtle hints that screamed louder the more I looked. They talked about meetings outside of business hours, and there were vague mentions of a usual spot they'd go to. It was enough to make my blood boil, but not enough to confront her just yet. A few days later, I hit my breaking point. I had to see it for myself. I knew Sophie had a meeting near one of our regular lunch spots, so I decided to swing by, pretending to just be passing through. And there they were, her and Maxwell, tucked away in the far corner, looking far too comfortable. They were laughing, leaning in a little too close. I could see that damn hair flick, the one she used to do when she was interested, when she wanted attention. Sophie saw me first, and her expression was a mix of surprise, guilt, and something else, irritation maybe. She waved me over, plastering on that forced smile she always used when she was trying to cover something up. "Hey, Tyler," she said, trying to sound casual, like there was nothing off about the whole situation. "Maxwell and I were just going over some client strategies." She put extra emphasis on client strategies, as if I was too dumb to understand. I played it cool, shook Maxwell's hand, and tried to act like everything was fine. But inside I was fuming. There was no reason for her to be so cozy with him. No client strategy required that much laughter at his lame jokes. I wanted to call her out right then and there, but I knew I needed more than just a hunch and an awkward lunch to go off of. After that meeting, I knew I had to dig deeper. Sophie had a close friend, Tessa, someone she'd trusted with almost everything. I figured Tessa would be the one to know if anything was off or if Sophie had been saying anything out of the ordinary. So, I reached out to her, trying to be casual about it, just checking in. I dropped a few hints, asking if Sophie seemed different to her lately. Tessa hesitated, but then she gave me this look that made my stomach drop. "Well, Tyler," she said, taking her time to choose her words carefully, "Sophie's been talking about wanting more out of life. She says she feels like she's missing out on something, like she needs to live a real life. Whatever that means." She paused, lowering her voice. She's been talking a lot about the people she's been meeting lately, especially Maxwell. She says he gets her ambitions. That was the moment I couldn't ignore anymore. Tessa didn't outright say it, but it was clear. Sophie was seeing Maxwell as more than just a business contact. I thanked Tessa, trying to keep my cool, and went home that night with a fire burning in my gut. Up until then, it was just suspicion. Now I had confirmation, at least from the way Sophie had been talking to her closest friends. She was seeking a life that didn't include me. A life Maxwell apparently was all too willing to offer. That night, Sophie came home late again. She was tense, clearly irritated about something, slamming her bag down on the counter and pulling off her shoes like she was angry at them. I could tell she was itching for a fight, and sure enough, she didn't wait long to start. "Do you even care about my career, Tyler?" she snapped, barely looking at me. "I feel like you don't get what it takes to succeed. You just want everything to stay the same. But I need more." "More," I repeated, barely holding my ground. "What exactly do you need, Sophie? More late-night meetings with Maxwell? More nights out?" She rolled her eyes like I was an idiot. "Oh, don't start with that," she said, clearly annoyed. "It's just business. Not everything's about you, Tyler. You think I'm doing all this for fun?" I wanted to scream at her, to demand the truth right there, but instead, I forced myself to keep my voice steady. "Are you sure it's just business? Because that doesn't explain the late nights, the new clothes, the perfume. If it's not about you, then what is it about?" She laughed. A bitter, humorless laugh. "Unbelievable. You really think I'm that shallow? I'm doing this for us, Tyler. For our future. Maybe if you actually supported me instead of throwing around baseless accusations, you'd understand that." The argument exploded, words flying back and forth until she stormed off to the bedroom, leaving me alone and seething. I could feel the distance between us, the wall that had been building for weeks, maybe even months. After that night, I knew I couldn't trust her anymore. She had said everything she needed to with her actions. The dismissive tone, the unwillingness to even acknowledge the possibility that I might have a reason to worry. Sitting there, I felt like the fool. The guy who'd built a business with his wife, thinking we'd be partners in everything. But now I could barely recognize her. As much as I wanted to believe it was all just the excitement of success, deep down I knew better. This wasn't about business. It was about her, and whatever it was she was looking for that Maxwell seemed all too eager to provide. I wasn't ready to end things, not yet. But I sure as hell wasn't going to sit back and let her destroy everything we'd built together. I'll never understand what made her leave her phone on the kitchen counter that night. Maybe she'd gotten careless, or maybe she just thought I was too naive, too trusting to ever take a look. Either way, there it was, buzzing away on the counter with that familiar sound, signaling a new message. I'd heard that noise 1,000 times before, but this time, something inside me snapped. I had to know. I grabbed the phone, my fingers almost trembling as I looked at the screen. The message was from Maxwell. It was short, straight to the point. Something about how much he'd enjoyed their last meeting at the hotel, and how he couldn't wait for the next one. My stomach turned cold. There it was, the confirmation of everything I'd been suspecting but praying wasn't true. She'd left the phone unlocked, and I couldn't help myself. I scrolled through their messages, and what I found hit me like a freight train. Messages about catching up, vague mentions of private dinners, and words from her that I hadn't heard in a long time. I wanted to confront her right then and there, but deep down I knew that wouldn't cut it. She'd find a way to explain it, spin it into something harmless. Maybe networking or some nonsense about important client relations. No, I needed more. I needed something irrefutable, and I knew exactly who could help me with that. The next day, I pulled Maya aside. She'd been with me since the early days, and if there was anyone I could count on, it was her. I told her everything, the late nights, the lunches with Maxwell, the message I'd found. She wasn't shocked. She'd already noticed how Sophie had changed. Maya offered to keep an eye on things, discreetly monitor Sophie's work activities, check her emails when she could. She'd even picked up on the fact that Sophie had started getting tickets to high-end events, ones I had no clue about. With Maya's help, The pieces of the puzzle started coming together. I knew Sophie liked to keep things close to the chest, but she wasn't as slick as she thought. The private meetings were becoming regular, and those tickets she'd been getting, they were for events I'd never heard of, exclusive ones, the kind Maxwell seemed to attend to. It felt like a sick game, with me standing on the sidelines, watching her live a life completely detached from us, from our dreams, our business, our future. But even that wasn't enough. I needed something more tangible, something I could use to put an end to this mess once and for all. That's when I reached out to a private investigator, someone Caleb had mentioned in passing. The guy didn't ask too many questions, just took the info I gave him and got to work. Over the next few weeks, he tracked Sophie to fancy restaurants, exclusive parties, and sure enough, hotel after hotel. Ninery time, Maxwell was right there, playing the part to perfection. When the photos came in, my stomach churned. There she was, looking happier than I'd seen her in years, dressed up like she was living her best life, with a man who wasn't me. They weren't even trying to hide it. In some of the photos, you could see them holding hands, exchanging those intimate glances I hadn't seen from her in, well, too long. That was it. I wasn't going to sit back and watch her carry on with this double life while pretending to be the devoted wife. So that night, when she walked in, I told her we needed to talk. She looked at me, narrowing her eyes, like she was trying to figure out if I knew something. "What's this about, Tyler?" she asked, trying to sound casual, but I could see the tension in her jaw. "I know about you and Maxwell," I said flatly, keeping my voice steady but cold. I wasn't going to give her any room to wiggle out of it. "I know about the hotels, the meetings, the messages. I've seen the photos, Sophie. Don't even think about lying." Her face drained of color, then flushed bright red. She opened her mouth, probably to deny it, but something in my expression must have told her it was pointless. She let out a long breath, crossing her arms and meeting my gaze with defiance. "And so what if I did?" she shot back, her voice dripping with dismissive coldness. "Can you really blame me? I've been stuck in this boring, predictable life for years, Tyler. You think all I wanted was a couple of business contracts and a cozy office." Her words hit like a punch to the gut, but I forced myself to stay calm. "I thought we were building something together, Sophie. I thought this was supposed to be about us, not about your dream life with some guy who's got a fat wallet." She let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. "You don't get it, do you? It's not just about money. It's about a lifestyle. It's about being with people who get ambition. Maxwell gets it. He's everything you're not: connected, influential, able to offer me a life that's more than this small-time setup." I don't know what I expected her to say, but hearing her justify it like that, with complete disdain for everything we'd built together, hit me harder than I thought it would. I'd poured my heart and soul into this business, sacrificed everything for it, and now she was just tossing it all aside like it was nothing, like she was just moving on. The anger inside me began to freeze over, hardening into something cold and methodical. I wasn't going to let her walk away from this without paying the price. After she'd finished her little speech, she stormed out of the room, leaving me standing there, the full weight of her betrayal settling in. I was done playing nice. If this was the life she wanted, then fine, she could have it, but it was going to cost her. The next day, I went straight to Caleb. I told him everything, about her affair with Maxwell, the disrespect she'd shown for everything we'd built, and my plan to make sure she didn't get away unscathed. Caleb was on board immediately. He'd never liked Maxwell, and he was more than willing to help me tear down whatever future Sophie thought she had planned. We spent hours strategizing, talking through the legal steps, and finding ways to strip her of whatever she thought she was entitled to, making sure she walked away with as little as possible. We met with a lawyer who knew how to work the system. Step by step, we began laying the foundation for a case that would legally bind Sophie's assets, severing her from the company, our finances, and everything she thought she had in her grasp. The anger inside me was like fuel, giving me a kind of energy I hadn't felt before, like a fire burning that just wouldn't go out, pushing me forward. I had the evidence now. I had allies. And soon, I'd have a plan that would make sure Sophie regretted every single moment she spent with Maxwell. There was no turning back. I was ready to watch her world fall apart, piece by piece, just like she had done to mine. When Caleb introduced me to Blake Turner, I knew things were about to get real, like stepping into a whole new game where Sophie wouldn't be able to manipulate her way out. Blake was exactly who I needed. A lawyer who knew how to navigate the system with a stone-cold stare, someone who could protect me from every angle Sophie might try to exploit. We sat in his office, and as I explained the situation, Blake listened intently, nodding here and there, his eyes sharpening as he processed the details. When I was done, he leaned back in his chair, a small, confident smirk pulling at the corner of his mouth. "Well, Tyler," he said, "if you want to go after everything she's trying to take, we can make this airtight. I'll make sure she doesn't touch a single cent of the company, and as for the divorce, she'll walk away with nothing. But we have to be careful with this." So we got to work. Taking Blake's advice, I started moving assets around, shifting funds into accounts Sophie couldn't touch. We set up a series of shell companies, each account protected by layers of legal armor that would be impossible to crack without my permission. Each move felt like building a fortress, and every dollar that shifted was another layer between me and whatever chaos Sophie might try to stir up. One of the most important steps was putting part of the company in my sister Chloe's name. Chloe had her own career, far outside our industry, and didn't know Sophie a damn thing. She was furious when I told her the full story and agreed without hesitation. By giving her partial ownership of the company, I was locking Sophie out. And if she tried to take me to court, she wouldn't have a chance. The company would be completely out of her reach. While all of this was going on, something else was starting to take shape. My relationship with Nina. Nina had been friends with Sophie for years, but she wasn't blind to what was happening. She saw it all for what it was, and she didn't feel sorry for her so-called friend anymore. For years, Nina had been overshadowed by Sophie, and now that Sophie had burned all her bridges, Nina was more than willing to help me tear down everything Sophie had built. She was invaluable, offering insights I never would have had. She knew the real Sophie, the one behind the fake smile, and every piece of information she shared helped me see the full scope of Sophie's betrayal. As the plan took shape, Nina and I spent more time together, and somewhere along the way our connection deepened. It wasn't planned, but it felt like fate, like we'd been drawn together by everything Sophie had done. Nina wanted justice just like I did, but with her it was more than that. She was loyal in a way Sophie never had been. As the lines between ally and something more started to blur, I realized how much I appreciated having her by my side. And honestly, watching Sophie's closest friend stand by me, ready to expose her, felt like a kind of revenge in itself. The next big move was with the investors. With Caleb and Nina's help, I set up a meeting with the most influential backers of our company. They were loyal, but they'd already seen the shift in Sophie's behavior and the toxic influence Maxwell had on her. We called them in, acting like it was just another routine quarterly check-in. But when they sat down, I laid it all out for them. Everything Sophie and Maxwell had been up to. I showed them the documents, the records of extravagant expenses, the tickets to exclusive events neither Caleb nor I had approved. The investors sat there in stunned silence, watching as I laid bare every penny Sophie and Maxwell had stolen for their own private little getaway. I could see the disgust on their faces, the shock as they realized just how far Sophie had gone. By the end of the meeting, any loyalty they might have had to her was gone. They backed me completely, signing off on measures that would ensure I stayed in control of the company. Any future business decisions made by Sophie or Maxwell would be null and void. With the company secured, I turned my attention to Maxwell. The guy had his fingers in all kinds of pies, always angling for the next big thing, always presenting himself as the kind of guy everyone wanted to work with. But after what he'd done, I was more than happy to watch that illusion come crashing down. I started reaching out to his business partners, slipping them information about his shady behavior, how he'd misused funds and manipulated resources for his own personal gain. The backlash was almost immediate. One by one, companies started pulling out of deals, distancing themselves from him. It didn't take long for word to spread that Maxwell wasn't the trustworthy businessman he made himself out to be. I heard through the grapevine that he was scrambling to salvage his reputation, desperately trying to hold onto his clients. Watching him struggle was a little too satisfying. Knowing that the empire he thought he'd built was falling apart because of his own actions, it was almost poetic. Sophie, meanwhile, had no clue what was happening. She was still under the delusion that her affair was a private matter, that I would just sit back and let her walk away without consequences. She had no idea that I had moved most of the company out of her reach or that her best friend was now my ally. She couldn't see the walls closing in on her, the damage already being done in the background. With every step I took, the weight of her betrayal lifted, replaced by a sense of control, a sense of purpose. By the time we hit the final stage, I had everything I needed. The assets were locked down, the investors were firmly on my side, and Maxwell's reputation was in shambles. Sophie and Maxwell thought they were untouchable, living out their fantasy with no consequences. But they had seriously misjudged things, blinded by their own egos. The day had finally come. Everything had been set up to perfection. The invitations, the agenda, the catering. It looked like any other business meeting, maybe a little more formal than usual, but nothing that would raise suspicion. Sophie and Maxwell were both there, completely unaware, thinking they were just attending another presentation about the company's next phase. I watched them mingle and laugh with clients, completely oblivious to the fact that this grand presentation was about to rip everything they'd worked to build out from under them. When everyone had settled, I stepped up to the stage, meeting the familiar faces of our investors, partners, and clients. I began with the usual spiel, talking about the company values, our mission to grow with integrity, and the importance of building lasting relationships. But as I spoke, my tone changed. I saw a few confused glances exchanged, the tension in the air starting to build as my words sharpened. Unfortunately, integrity isn't something everyone in this room has been able to uphold, I said, scanning the audience, feeling the shift. I could see the confusion spread across the room, Sophie looking around nervously, trying to figure out where this was going. I let the silence stretch before I continued. Recently, I've come across some very disturbing revelations about betrayal within our team, I said, letting my gaze settle on Sophie. I watched her eyes widen as realization hit her. Beside her, Maxwell stiffened, his confident smirk starting to fade. I clicked a button on the remote, and the screen behind me lit up with financial records and bank statements, highlighting the money that had been funneled out of the company into business expenses that had nothing to do with business. I watched their expressions change, the shock and horror sinking in as the room took in the details. Lavish dinners, exclusive events, and private hotel stays, all paid for with company funds. I trusted these individuals, I continued, my voice steady but filled with fury. I believed in them as partners, as leaders in this company. But it turns out I was wrong. These funds weren't spent on growing our business. They were used to fuel personal indulgences by people who thought they were above accountability. I switched to the next slide. Photos of Sophie and Maxwell together at the events, laughing, walking hand in hand, cozying up at private dinners. Gasps filled the room, and Sophie's face turned bright red. I could see her eyes darting to the exits, desperate to escape, hoping this would somehow vanish. Maxwell tried to hold it together, but I could see the desperation setting in. He shot up from his seat, trying to stammer out some excuse. This is all a misunderstanding. But the investors weren't having it. One by one, they turned their heads in disgust, some shaking their heads, some getting up and walking away, their faces painted with betrayal. "You think this is a misunderstanding?" I asked, my voice cutting through the silence. "This is a betrayal, not just of our business, but of every single person in this room who trusted you." More evidence flashed on the screen. Screenshots, messages between them, talking about living the good life and making plans for their next escape. I watched Sophie's perfect mask crack, her eyes filling with panic as each new message exposed the depths of her deceit. The room exploded into chaos. People were muttering, some were leaving, others were glaring at Sophie and Maxwell, their eyes filled with disgust. I saw Sophie look to Maxwell, but he wasn't even looking at her. He was staring straight ahead, face pale, mouth tight. He made one last-ditch effort to salvage the situation, standing up and shouting, "Look, this was all exaggerated. We didn't do anything illegal." But no one was listening. Investors were walking out, shaking their heads in disbelief. I watched Maxwell finally give up, grabbing his coat and heading straight for the door without sparing Sophie a second glance. He ditched her the moment things went south, leaving her to face the fallout alone. Sophie, still in shock, tried to salvage what was left of her pride, muttering about miscommunication and work-related outings. But the room wasn't buying it. Her voice faltered, and the helpless look in her eyes told the whole story. For the first time, she saw the real consequences of her actions, and it was happening in front of an audience, a brutal public downfall. Once the noise died down, I took the mic again. "Effective immediately," I said, my voice firm and final. "Sophie and Maxwell are no longer associated with this company. With the support of our legal team and the approval of our investors, they will be removed from any and all involvement in our operations." Caleb stood beside me, a quiet satisfaction on his face. We had made sure that Sophie wouldn't just lose her position. She'd lose everything. All the work she'd put into her schemes with Maxwell, all her plans were now reduced to rubble. By the time the meeting wrapped up, Sophie was left standing there, completely alone. The last traces of her confident, manipulative self were shattered beyond recognition. She scanned the room, her eyes desperate for any sign of support, but all she saw were faces turned away. In that moment, it hit her. She had lost everything. Her reputation, her career, the company, and any hope of salvaging the dream she'd traded me in for. I watched her walk out of the building, her shoulders slumped, looking every bit as defeated as she had made me feel months before. The weeks that followed were a blur. With the public humiliation still fresh in everyone's minds, the next move was clear. I filed for divorce, and with Blake's expertise, we made sure it was watertight. Every part of our plan, from transferring assets to my sister Chloe's name, to moving company funds into accounts Sophie couldn't touch, ensured a smooth, decisive process. She had no claim to anything I'd worked for. I'd safeguarded everything, down to the last cent. Sophie didn't put up a fight, at least not in the public eye. By the time the papers were signed, her life had already begun to spiral. The affair had left her drowning in debt, debts she and Maxwell had run up during their little dream world. She'd hoped she could tap into company funds to cover it all, but with everything locked down, she was left to face the mess she'd created on her own. Blake made sure not a single asset slipped through her fingers, leaving her with nothing but the wreckage of her choices. After the scandal broke, people in our circle started cutting ties with her. Tessa, once one of her closest friends, turned her back completely, realizing just how deep the betrayal had run. Former colleagues stopped answering her calls. She became a liability, a symbol of shame to everyone who once held her in high regard. I started hearing rumors, whispers about how desperate she was, how her reputation had crumbled. Nobody wanted to be associated with her anymore. Nina, on the other hand, had become a steady presence in my life. After everything that had happened, her loyalty felt like a breath of fresh air. Our connection grew stronger, evolving into something deeper and more secure. She stood beside me, not just as a romantic partner, but as someone I could trust completely. She'd shown me loyalty in ways I never imagined, and as we spent more time together, I began to see just how invaluable she was. Not just in my personal life, but in my professional one, too. She got involved in the business, offering advice, helping me strategize, and eventually suggesting we invest together in a new venture. She had a sharp mind, and her ideas injected energy into the work I thought I'd lost interest in. With Caleb's backing and a few loyal partners, I launched a new business. This time, we focused on innovative financial consulting, capitalizing on shifts in the market and filling gaps that others had missed. The response was overwhelming. Clients who respected my ethics and business acumen flocked to us, and within months, we were seeing growth far beyond what I had anticipated. And the best part? I didn't have to worry about hidden motives or trust issues anymore. Meanwhile, Maxwell's downfall was quick and brutal. Word about his involvement in the scandal spread like wildfire. His unethical practices, his attempts to maintain the lifestyle he didn't deserve, became public knowledge. As partners and investors dropped him one by one, he was left scrambling to stay afloat. He had to sell off assets, liquidate holdings, and eventually faded out of the business world entirely. For someone who had built his life on appearances, losing his reputation was a fate worse than losing his wealth. And then there was Sophie. With debts piling up and her reputation in tatters, she couldn't find stable ground. Once seen as a powerful woman in her field, she was now reduced to scraping by with low-paying jobs that barely covered her bills. The industry that had once respected her now saw her as a liability. Any hope she had of rebuilding her career was crushed under the weight of her own decisions. She had traded everything, stability, love, and a real future, for a fantasy with Maxwell, and now she was paying the price. She was starting from scratch just like the rest of us when we first began. Only this time, she had no allies to help her. As for me, the future had never felt so open. I was free, finally unburdened by the weight of lies and betrayal. My relationship with Nina grew in ways I hadn't expected. She wasn't just my partner. She was someone I could rely on completely, without a shred of doubt. Ninery Day felt like a fresh start, a new chance to live without the shadows of the past looming over me. Reflecting on everything, I felt lighter, like I'd shed years of weight I didn't even know I'd been carrying. The business was thriving, my personal life was stable, and the scars from the ordeal had transformed into a kind of strength and clarity I hadn't had before. I had survived betrayal, heartache, and the attempts to strip me of everything I'd built. And in the end, I came out on top, surrounded by people I could trust. Sophie's story, though, was different. She was out there, trying to piece together a life she'd shattered, facing the brutal reality that she'd traded stability and love for a dream that turned out to be nothing more than a mirage. She had lost everything, and now she had to live with the weight of that knowledge, along with the loneliness and regret that came with it. As for me, I was finally moving forward, unburdened, with my path clear ahead of me. The past was where it belonged, behind me,